If we understood health and disease, we wouldn't have so much chronic illness. We'd be able to handle these allegedly viral issues so much better than we currently are. So that means there's something big missing in our understanding. There might be other reasons people get sick. So like toxicity, poisons in our food, in the air, in our homes, in our environment, those sorts of things can make people sick. Most people wouldn't even debate that. The question is, what's the degree of it?
Your organization has achieved a significant dent in vaccine mandates.
We didn't do the science. We didn't do the clinical trials. We didn't do the post-safety. But one thing we know it's rare.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for another engaging episode of Shot Callers. I am Carrie Bigford, Outreach Director with Texans for Vaccine Choice. And today we have a wonderful guest in the form of 7-time author Mark Gober. And we're going to be discussing one of his recent books, which is An End to Upside Down Medicine. Mark is a very accomplished author, and I really enjoyed his books. I am very excited to have him here to share him with all of you. Without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Hi, Carrie. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So your book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, was 2 essential parts. Could you summarize the first half of the book for people, the germ versus terrain theory part of the book?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, the book poses a challenge to the allopathic approach to medicine as basically saying this should not be the primary approach to medicine because it has many flaws, without saying this is definitely the correct way to approach medicine. I propose many ideas, but I look at many of the assumptions that are embedded within the allopathic approach and show the flaws. So the first half of the book is devoted to germ theory, which is really a core part of the allopathic approach, which likes to look at little microbes as things that are attacking us, and those are things to be killed with a pill, for example. And it sounds funny saying that sometimes because it's so deeply ingrained in modern thinking that is all true, what I just said, and that's something that we should be doing. But what I didn't realize until researching for this book was that many of the assumptions about germ theory have not been validated using the scientific method. And the way I like to divide it up is into 2 categories. One is categories of germs that for which there's no debate about their existence, like bacteria, fungi, parasites, for example. And the other category is viruses, a virus has a very specific definition, which we'll get into. And there is a large and growing body of people, including accomplished doctors, who are questioning whether or not viruses even exist or whether they've been established to exist using the scientific method, meaning having an independent variable and proper controls in the studies. So I'll start with the first category of bacteria, fungi, and parasites. And like I said, people are not questioning, at least as far as I've come across, whether or not they exist. The question is, what is their role? So for example, if a person has what we might call an overgrowth of bacteria, and we can see them and we can study what those bacteria are, the question becomes, did the bacteria cause the sickness in the person, or did the bacteria arrive at the scene because the organism had some kind of underlying toxicity? And the bacteria, which in nature, they're often saprophytic, meaning that they clean up dead and dying tissue. They break that stuff down. Are the bacteria arriving in large quantities because there's some underlying issue that the bacteria are needed for? And sure, it's possible that the bacteria in large quantities will be emitting endotoxins, for example, which can lead to additional toxicity. The question is, but are the bacteria helpful in the same way that like firefighters are putting out fires? We don't say firefighters cause the fire if we see firefighters at the scene of a fire. So there's this often an issue of correlation versus causation, where people will see 2 things in the same place and they'll assume that one caused the other without actually considering other possibilities. And the same thing goes for fungi and parasites. Although with regard to parasites, I will say there's more chatter about that, especially with regard to the really, really small ones, the protozoa. Daniel Roitas did a webinar with Dr. Tom Cowan, and he was questioning whether or not those very tiny parasites have been established using the scientific method. But there is no question about much larger parasites that we can all see with our eyes that they do exist.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful kind of summary of it. And like allopathic medicine and germ theory is the basic underpinning of the vaccine program as well. And in my research and discovery of, the breadth of opinions around viruses and whatnot, the thing that has always struck me are the parallels between the assumptive science supporting the existence of viruses. It really closely mirrors the assumptive science around the safety and efficacy of vaccines, because the idea of viruses came around decades and decades prior to the scientific ability to see something so small. And so it really begs the question of, now that we have that technology, why have we been unsuccessful at seeing what we are assuming is there, right? Like, it's fascinating.
It's a great question. And again, this is a question I didn't even know existed. And when I speak with many people today, they don't know the history of virology. So let's take a few steps back. And I think you made a very important point, Carrie, which is that, sure, we could spend all day talking about the ingredients in vaccines and whether or not they've been appropriately tested for safety and efficacy. But if there doesn't exist a microbe that causes disease, then you wouldn't even have to ask those questions, because there's no need for a vaccine. So that's why this is such a big deal. And viruses are of course, very important in this, because most microbial illnesses where we have a vaccine, it's for a virus. There are some, I believe, for bacteria too, alleged bacterial infections.
Tetanus.
Yes, but
tetanus
most
is a bacterial infection, right?
But most are viral. So this is a very big deal.
Most are viral. Yes, it is.
And so what is a virus? And actually, before starting this, because your audience might be asking this question, our discussion here today is not debating whether or not people get sick. People do get sick and they have symptoms, and sometimes they can die because the symptoms are so severe. The question is, what caused the symptoms? So people go to a party and a bunch of them get sick with similar symptoms afterwards. They'll often say, I caught something at the party. But implied in the word caught means they're describing the modern definition of a virus, rather than considering other reasons they could have gotten sick, such as toxins in the environment, toxins in the air, food poisoning, psychospiritual, maybe other elements of science that we don't even understand. So there are a lot of other possibilities. It doesn't just have to be a virus. So this notion of a virus, it has a specific definition today. Going back to the Greeks, the word eos is where virus comes from, and they were referring to a poison. So the word virus didn't always mean what it means today, which today it refers to a type of an intracellular parasite. It gets inside of a host cell, it replicates, it explodes out, goes into other cells in an organism, and in that process, it causes physical symptoms in that organism, and then jumps from one organism into another one. Okay. The problem is that what I just described has never been observed. Let that sink in. No one has ever observed that. So that's a big problem.
I kept wanting that to be wrong, right? Like talking to Dr. Mark Bailey and his wife Sam and kind of being introduced to the subject matter, I experienced a lot of personal resistance, because it was a worldview shift to even consider such an idea. And I am not here at all saying that TFEC is on board with the no virus theory. We're here just presenting information, as we often do. But it was quite shocking to really dive down and see for myself that no, in fact, it has never been isolated in the same way with the same top shelf methodology as has, bacteria, parasites, and fungi. And that was quite shocking to me. And I'm still like, ooh, that's quite the uncomfortable thing.
Very.
And why has that not happened yet, right? If it's so prevalent and we know so much about them, why have we been never able to capture that piece when we've captured so many other things? We've captured the entire reproductive cycle from start to finish. Why can we not capture this?
Well, there are a few reasons that scientists will tell you we haven't been able to see the process of viral infection that allegedly occurs. And viruses are supposed to be so small that they're difficult to see. And the other explanation is that viruses, because they're intracellular parasites, they're always inside of a host cell. So you would never see the virus by itself, which is, number one, a convenient definition. But also, it doesn't line up with the viral process, allegedly, because the virus is supposed to enter the host cell and then go out of the host cell into other cells, meaning you should be able to capture the virus in between the process. And so there's a distinction here. What I described to you was the whole process of a virus causing infection and being contagious. No one has ever observed that chain. But what we're now getting into, and I heard you alluding to this, is the notion of viral isolation, which is actually having the viral particle by itself and showing that it actually exists as an independent thing.
The same way we do bacterial, parasites, and fungi.
Or to use an analogy from Dr. Tom Cowan, he says if you wanted to isolate a hammer from a toolbox, you would take the hammer out of the toolbox and then you'd be able to study it and characterize it. It seems like a very simple thing. And from the perspective of the scientific method, if you wanted to show that something causes disease, you'd want to have that thing by itself and then introduce it into a situation and see what happens. It's called an independent variable. And the problem is that the way virology studies have been done, it doesn't work that way. So let's
it's a cell substrate.
They end up looking at a cell culture, but let's take it back even further. So going back to the 1800s of Louis Pasteur, he identified that there was illness associated with these dog bites and rabies. And he said, well, we can't find anything there, but there must be something so small that's there. Something that we don't even have the equipment to see. And then eventually the electron microscope came about, starting in the 1930s, and then the decades after that, it became more prevalent, where you could see things as small as a virus is alleged to be. So your audience might be wondering, wait, SARS-CoV-2, I've definitely seen pictures of that virus. What are you talking about? So we have to understand, what is it that they're looking at? It's true that they might see that structure, but what is it? And this goes back to the 1954 gold standard study of what is called viral isolation. To me, the word isolation has been perverted, because isolation traditionally means to separate one thing from all other things, like taking the hammer out of the toolbox. And you need to do that in order to have an independent variable. But that's not what happens. So in this 1954 study by Enders and Peebles, and Enders won a Nobel Prize later that year for something slightly different. So a very credible guy. Now I'm just going to summarize this in layman's terms. They took fluids from a person who was sick with what they called measles. So someone who was sick, and they assumed this person had something viral, and they partially filtered those fluids. They took the fluids from that sick person and they put it into a soup of material. It's called a cell culture. And this soup has things like antibiotics and monkey kidney cells and a whole host of other things. And what the scientists concluded is, after they added the fluids from a sick person that they assumed had a virus in it, they took the fluids from a sick person, put it into the cell culture, and some of the cells broke down in the cell culture. And they concluded, oh, there was a virus that caused the cells to break down. And that, of course, leaves out many other reasons that cells could break down, such as all the other materials in the cell
all the
culture,
other ingredients.
or maybe other things in the fluids from a sick person. They didn't actually isolate it. They found an indirect metric using an unpurified sample, and they said, we infer that there's a virus here, but they don't usually say the word infer. So when we're looking under an electron microscope, it's always a sample that might have other things in it that are non-viral. And so you're looking under an electron microscope. You have to then tamper with the sample, stain it with resin, basically slice it up, and you're looking at something that is still and not living, whereas a virus is supposed to be moving around and living to some degree. So we don't even know the thing that they're looking at, that it is an intracellular parasite that replicates. It's just inferred.
Yeah, there's just so many parallels in terms of assumptions and missing verifiable data to, the vaccine safety and efficacy science. There really are just so many parallels to it that I find it fascinating, because that's one of my, original beefs with the program, is just the lack of actual hardcore evidence of safety and efficacy that exists in every single vaccine that's been there. Hopefully RFK will help shift that over time. But to date, it's deplorable. And looking at the virus theory, which is such a foundational piece of our culture and how we view ourselves and how we view medicine and health, that it's just so amazing to me that they have not been able to do this, what seems the foundational step of isolation. Yeah.
It's quite mind-blowing.
It is.
We're not told that these are inferences. So for example,
we're told that we know the science is settled.
Right. They'll say, Carrie, what are you talking about? We have the genetic sequence. We have the genome for SARS-CoV-2. Here's the problem again, because you never have an isolated virus, a purified sample, a virus with nothing else. If you're taking genetic sequences and then putting it into a computer and doing all kinds of crazy things that most people don't understand to put together a genome, you need to know that those genetic fragments are coming from a virus rather than something else. Yeah. And so as Dr. Mark Bailey said, who I know you had on your show, he said that you're looking at genetic fragments of unknown provenance. You don't even know where this stuff's coming from. So anytime they use the word viral, whether it's viral protein, viral antigen, viral antibody, viral morphology, the word viral presupposes that all of those things that come after it relate to a virus that no one has ever found. So it's called a reification fallacy, where you speak about something over and over and over again as if it's real, but it's actually an abstraction. But in speaking about it so much, you actually like reify it into existence.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it is definitely paradigm rocking to kind of dive into it for yourself. And a lot of people are so deeply resistant to even having that worldview threatened that they're not even willing to explore it, which I always find fascinating for a whole host of other reasons, right? So that's a wonderful summation of the germ theory aspect. Tell me more about the opposite side, the terrain theory.
Yes. Well, can I add one more point, Carrie? This is one that really swayed me in my research. As I'm not a doctor, but what I've tended to do is to go into different domains, whether it's consciousness or cosmology, all these different areas. And I did have two formerly mainstream doctors read and review the book before it was published, Dr. Mark Bailey and Dr. Andrew Kaufman. But in any event, for me, as a non-doctor, I was able to look at the work of Christine Massey and her colleagues who have sent freedom of information requests to organizations all over the world, like the CDC, health organizations all over the world. And what they say repeatedly when she and her colleagues ask for something very simple, they say, please show me a purified sample of SARS-CoV-2, or you name it, many other viruses as well. And they'll specify in these letters, don't give me something that passes through a cell culture first, where there's something indirect. And what do the organizations say repeatedly? They say, we have no records of this. And there was one example that I quoted in my book from a health organization in Canada. They said, what you're asking for is impossible because you're asking for something that goes against the gold standard. The gold standard of quote unquote isolation is to use a cell culture. So to me, that was great validation because I saw the requests and I saw what these health organizations said. They're admitting we do not have a truly independent variable in any of these studies. And that means we've never had a purified sample of just a virus.
Right. And it seems like just for no other reason than to quell the conversation and the debate that if it were possible that you think that that could have been produced at some point or be in the works of being produced currently. And yet it's not. Like all there is an ideological pushback and upset, which I find very interesting from a human perspective. Right.
Yeah, it's quite stunning. And I'm hoping, and I really appreciate that you're willing to discuss this topic because it's one thing to question vaccines, which has become controversial enough. But there's only a subset of people who are questioning vaccines that are looking at this issue of germ theory and viruses. And hopefully our own government and RFK Jr. and others will look at these fundamental issues because it would shortcut a lot of the problems. If we don't have the germ causing disease, then we don't have to think about vaccines. Right.
And the blowback from that would only be, slightly meteoric. I mean, my goodness, it would it would only upend the entire foundations of our healthcare system and the way in which we're serving people and the way in which we're viewing ourselves, right? Because the view of germ theory is in a lot of ways disempowering, this idea of you being a weak organism, always at prey of other organisms and needing external help to heal from those invisible attackers is a much different viewpoint than terrain theory, which is in a lot of ways the opposite of germ theory. Yeah.
Yeah, so terrain theory basically posits that in the same way we need to take care of the soil, for example, to grow plants. We need to take care of the terrain of our own body, and that will enable us to be healthy. Some people blend terrain and germ theory to say, oh, well, if the terrain of your body's in good shape, then you're going to be better able to fight off germs. That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
It's reasonable, but if we haven't established that germs definitively cause disease using the scientific method, then it's really all terrain, meaning there aren't these invisible enemies that we are inferring are causing disease. So that leads to a whole host of questions. And a preface to this discussion, I think, is an important one, which is it's possible to falsify one model without having a replacement one that's comprehensive. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's possible for us to say, well, these studies haven't conclusively shown that this microbe causes disease, but you know what? I'm not sure what does. So that leads us in this place of I don't know and exploration where we need to have more funding. So hopefully by challenging germ theory, there will be more funding to get into these answers. But with that said, I think there's some categories we could talk about that seem to make sense where there might be other reasons people get sick. So like toxicity, poisons in our food, in the air, in our homes, in our environment, those sorts of things can make people sick. Most people wouldn't even debate that. The question is, what's the degree of it? That we can get into things like electricity and EMFs and radiation. That's another possibility. I mentioned before this notion of psychospiritual issues, which is not really part of mainstream science, but it's been a big part of my own research. And there's a lot of science, I think, that's going to push us in this direction. So this would be in the category of thinking about the role of the psyche. To what degree are our own emotions causing or impacting our health? Or if we have, in like German New Medicine is an interesting area of study, where if a person perceives an event subjectively as a conflict, where there's some criteria where they have to feel isolated in dealing with the conflict, it has to be unexpected, but that can cause various reactions in the body. And sometimes after the person has resolved the conflict, the symptoms emerge. That's one area of thinking. There's also an area of thinking around a human biofield and human resonance between people. So we know, for example, when women cohabitate, sometimes their menstrual cycles will synchronize. Or when people are together, it seems like yawns are contagious, but we don't think there's a microbe. So I hope this just opens your audience's mind to other possibilities out there that science doesn't really understand yet.
Yeah, I would definitely, before I joined Team TFEC, I was a practicing mental health professional for a number of years. And I cannot even count how many times resolving someone's emotional trauma would heal their chronic illness quite spontaneously. Like I saw that correlation myself with real people over a number of years. And, there's definitely some type of connection there. And even as you had said in your book, even the generational wounding, sometimes you can go back and back to the generational wounding. And as you heal that generational wound, that chronic ailment or, considered defect dissolves. It's quite fascinating to witness all the levels that we don't understand. And I really appreciate how you are so comfortable saying, I don't know, because there's so much that we don't know, even as we're looking at these different theories and seeing what fits and what doesn't fit, to acknowledge that the whole picture is so much bigger than we're probably grasping.
Exactly. And that leaves us, it's just uncomfortable sometimes to admit, we don't understand why people are getting sick, or maybe it's multifactorial.
We love to have those boxes checked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to me, the proof is in the pudding. If we understood health and disease, we wouldn't have so much chronic illness. We'd be able to handle these allegedly viral issues so much better than we currently are. So that means there's something big missing in our understanding.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The second half of your book, the first half I found very interesting and engaging, and I love that you didn't try and lead me one direction or the other. But the second half, where you really applied consciousness, I love that. I was vibing very hardcore with that second half of the book. And I loved it for a lot of reasons, but one of it is it helped explain some of the deficits in the terrain theory advocates. They haven't really acknowledged that consciousness part yet, or articulated it so clearly as you did. So tell me more about how the consciousness piece is needed and how that contributes to our overall experience. Like I love that part when you were talking about the magnetic resonance of humans and how we align with the polarity of the earth. And it really made me curious, as we're seeing scientifically evidence of our polarity shifting, right? As has shifted before, the polarity of our earth is kind of getting wonky. Do you think that difference in magnetism polarity is having an effect on our collective behavior as a society? Because humans have kind of gone a little nuts, I love them. They're my people, but goodness.
Well, to me, the fundamental question relates to the notion of consciousness and whether consciousness, and I'm referring to the part of us that is experiencing, basically, our subjective inner awareness. And it's difficult to describe because we can't touch it.
The observer standpoint.
Yes, we can't draw it out, but we all know we have it.
We all know we have it, right?
We have it because we're having an experience. And the traditional view in science, and certainly in allopathic medicine, is it's a reductionistic perspective that the universe is fundamentally made of material stuff. And after billions of years of a universe, human beings and other organisms evolve who have brains like humans, and out of the brain pops our consciousness. So in that perspective, consciousness is localized to an individual, or it's within individuals. There wouldn't really be an interconnected consciousness or some kind of metaphysical force in the same way if it's just an individual brain, individual consciousness, versus the idea that I've been exploring since my first book came out in 2018, in N2 Upside Down Thinking, which is that maybe our brain is like an antenna receiver or an interface or some kind of filtering mechanism, and consciousness is way beyond the body and our body is tapping into it. Once we go in that direction, all of a sudden, maybe there is a point to what you said there, Carrie, that we're tapping into something similar. There's an analogy that I often reference from Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher, who says that all of reality could be likened to a stream of water, this infinite stream. And water is analogous to consciousness here. Each of us as an individual is like a whirlpool within the stream. So we are interconnected in some ways, but we are also localizations, individuations of the water. And that opens up a whole other door. Even if it's not a precise analogy, the idea that we could be part of something much bigger that our brain is normally not letting us perceive, but it might still be there. And if that's true, we have to be open to all these other kinds of possibilities of interconnectedness, resonance, and how does that affect our physical form? I'll give one example that has stood out to me for years. The University of Virginia, they have a division of perceptual studies at the med school there. They've studied over 2,500 cases of young children who are speaking about some other life. And it's very difficult to explain how the children are talking about this. But the researchers are able to find historical records sometimes that validate the children. Now, as it pertains to medicine, sometimes the children have birthmarks and physical defects in their body that correspond to the way they claim to have died as some other person. And the researchers in these cases, they say they can find medical records that say, oh yeah, there was a person that died in this manner. Now, if that's even 1% true, what Dr. Ian Stevenson from UVA says, that in traditional science, they believe that there are two factors impacting our health: genetics and environment. And he said, in these studies, we're seeing something that's not genetic and not environmental. In other words, there's a third factor affecting the physical form. And if there's a third factor or a fourth or a fifth, we have to reconsider medicine in a big way.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. It just explored all of the deficits in what we could be getting and we could be experiencing in our healthcare journeys that we're just being denied about. I loved your stories also in the book about people who had received transplanted organs and then began to take on characteristics and or memories of their donor. Like that's also, it's unexplained by our allopathic model. It's completely and thoroughly unexplained. It shouldn't be happening. And yet it does happen. Right?
Yes.
And that's
incredible.
A real phenomenon. I mean, it just shows you how much more powerful than than we've been led to believe, and how much more there is to our existence than what's on the surface. So it's cool.
And this is a commonly reported phenomenon, although it's not spoken about much in the medical community. When people receive an organ from another person, they often change. And their preferences, their food preferences will change. Their personality shifts. There's a book called The Heart's Code by Dr. Paul Pearsall, where he goes through many of these cases. But actually, a few weeks ago, I met someone who had an organ transplant, and I pulled him aside and I said, have you noticed anything has changed since you got that organ? He goes, how'd you know? Like, people around me say I'm really different. I don't feel like I'm quite the same person. There's certain foods I don't even want anymore. So this is a real phenomenon where what's going on? The consciousness basically of one person can be transferred, at least in part, through the transference of an organ. What does that tell us about the energetic connection?
Absolutely. Yeah, the energetic connection, the interconnectedness of all things is quite fascinating. And also your example of like the plant who could tell when you were going to harm it or not, when you had the plant hooked up to the lie detector test. It wasn't you, but it was somebody else doing an experiment. And they had a plant hooked up to a lie detector test, and then it could perceive that person's real intent. And when they were pretending, it didn't react at all. But they knew when you meant it for real. And that's so true. There's something about human presence and human energetic presence that's undeniable. Like in our outreach work, we spend a lot of time teaching people a self-awareness about their own presence, right? Because there's a huge piece about being regulated emotionally and having good, strong presence to reach out to someone, because they can feel that stronger than almost anything else you'll ever say. They will pick up on your vibe. And I love that even the plant could pick up on a negative or positive intention, right?
Yes. So this is the work of Cleve Baxter, who used to run lie detection for the CIA. One day he decided to do an experiment to hook his plant up to a lie detector and to see if it would react. And he couldn't get it to do anything for a while. But eventually he thought in his mind, like you said, he had the real intent that he was going to burn the leaf. And then the lie detector spiked. So he wrote in his book, Primary Perception, this was the life-changing moment. And he then proceeded to do other studies where he was taking cells out of a human body and looking at how those cells were responding while the person was having some kind of emotional charge. The cells outside the body would change. So this is another area that requires a lot more funding and research, but it would revolutionize our thinking of health.
Yeah, I mean, what a way that that would change, and what an empowering system that would be for the individual, right? To not be at the mercy of something external, but to know that the solution truly is within, and that you're so much more powerful than you were originally told that you were, and that you can heal even from tremendously terrible things. Like the stories you were sharing about people who had spontaneous healings from cancers, Anita Morjani's near-death experiences, those were just fascinating examples of consciousness that were just goodness, so wonderful to read about. Yeah.
That's a really powerful one, because cancer is something physical that you can see it. And what happened to Anita Morjani is that she was dying of terminal cancer, tumors all over her body, and had a near-death experience, which has been reported throughout history. But in the last several decades, there are many more reports because people are being resuscitated due to medical technology. And she had a classic near-death experience. She encountered her deceased father. She felt unconditional love, and she realized things about her own psyche that she wanted to change. She was resuscitated, and within weeks, the tumors disappeared. She shifted in her consciousness somehow. She resolved conflicts, apparently, or who knows what else happened energetically, and the physical tumors disappeared because of something that shifted on a more etheric or metaphysical or consciousness level.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the interplay between the mind and the body and the spirit is just fascinating. And, a lot of other religions, a lot of different, personal growth processes always talk about that. The increasing of the energetic frequency, the awareness of the interconnectedness, and the way that it can physically change things. Like the nocebo effect fascinates me also. The idea that people can talk themselves or believe themselves into illness or harm without any physical impetus at all. And as you interact with humans, you see those types of people who have very disempowering belief systems and are making themselves quite literally ill with it. And then you see someone else with an entirely different mindset who's thriving despite external circumstances, right? I mean, it's really just fascinating.
Right. It shows how much of our health is potentially from within our own consciousness. And there are many studies on this showing the effect of consciousness on physical systems, like random number generators. These are just machines, computers that spit out zeros and ones in a random fashion. So if you watch the machine over a long period of time and do the math, you'll see roughly 50% ones, 50% zeros. However, in some of the studies that have been done, including studies that were run at Princeton University, the researchers would ask a normal person to try to influence the machine with his or her mind. So not touching the machine, just saying, Carrie, I want you to try to make this machine produce more ones than zeros. And what the researchers find repeatedly is that people are able to do this. It's not 100% ones, 0% zeros, but it's beyond chance. It's above 50%. Right. And that's statistically significant. So this is just one study of many showing the physical effect of a consciousness shift and intention. Yeah. What does intention do to the physical world, including our body?
Yeah. I mean, it opens up the door for personal empowerment and for people to really take full ownership of their embodiment and everything that means, including their mindset and belief systems and what they're putting out into the universe, right? Because you can accomplish a lot of things with a great attitude. Yeah, I thought that was really just quite neat. And I was really just fascinated by the idea of the magnetic polarity of the earth also impacting our behavior in a measurable way. And that kind of jogged my memory about how, oh goodness, so if the polarity of the earth is shifting in a natural cycle, then what does that mean for all of us? And how will that affect us as a species, being subject to those magnetic polarity changes? And then, the responsive kombucha I thought was really interesting, how it responded to feelings. It reminded me of the Masaru Emoto water studies, when he would, which is so fascinating work. And I know that Veda Austin has continued that work in a whole different way. But that truth of how even the water molecules, just through the mere power of intention and consciousness, would completely shift based on something that was completely untangible. And it was really fascinating.
And this whole area of study is basically thrown out of mainstream medicine because mainstream allopathic medicine assumes a materialistic perspective or a physicalist perspective, that it's all based on matter. And the reason that things happen in the universe is because of little billiard balls, microscopic billiard balls. This one hits this one, hits this one. Versus this metaphysical, if you want to call it spiritual, that's just the way science is directing us, that part is basically left out of the allopathic system. I think it's one of the huge flaws because they're only going to be looking at things within a little box. And certainly that can be helpful for emergency situations and acute
For sure.
injury.
I get hit by a truck, you take me to a trauma surgeon.
Yes. But in terms of getting to the root cause of illness, in many cases, beyond getting hit by a truck, I think we're missing a lot.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that they've lost the plot in terms of producing a long-term health outcome versus a short-term crisis resolution, which is where allopathic really seems to shine, as a short-term crisis resolution. I also loved how in the book you talked about the power of surrender, right? Surrendering to the consciousness, surrendering to the feeling that you're having now without judging it or labeling it. And it just reminded me, again, about our outreach, because I'm only moderately obsessed with our outreach work at TFEC, just a little bit. And the fourth step in our outreach is always allow, right? And allowing on the surface seems like a passive step, but it's always a surrender. And people don't always surrender gracefully. And so I love that you had that acknowledgement that, to just part of the healing process to get to that place of healing is to acknowledge where you are now without wanting it to be different or needing it to be different.
Yeah, Dr. David Hawkins, a former psychiatrist, he wrote a book called Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender. And I often cite his work because he saw this as really fundamental to people's health and also to their personal development and their spiritual evolution. If we think about it deeply, I think he has a very strong point here, because a lot of us assume that we have much more control over life than we actually do because of this implicit belief in causality being based on little billiard balls, one hitting the next, versus the notion that there might be spiritual forces out there or energies or something as in the interconnected field that is affecting life, whether it's our individual life or affecting the world at large. And we don't always see those little steps happening. It's a nonlinear thing. And once we acknowledge that, the desire to try to control every outcome, it diminishes. So it's a combination to me of surrendering control on one level, but then also wanting to act where it's necessary.
Right. Acting in your own appropriate lane of control too, right? Because really, the most you can ever really hope to control is yourself, and you can't even control all aspects of yourself. Everything else is just how well can you adapt and how fast can you do it? And I love the idea of the suggested viewpoint that disease in and of itself could be viewed as like an evolutionary stimulus, right? And that the idea, which had never actually occurred to me before, so I found it very profound, that the idea of chronic symptom suppression, as we have in our allopathic system currently, could also translate into a spiritual stagnation, because you're not allowed to experience the full breadth of of what's happening to you. Like, I thought that was very deep, Mr. Gober.
Thank you. The way I like to think about it is, what's the purpose? Who are we and why are we here? And if we exist as souls to some degree, if we want to apply the consciousness metaphor, that we're a vehicle for some broader consciousness, a lot of the research I've done points to the idea that we are here to have certain learning experiences and to evolve and grow. And we could look at our challenges in life, whether they're medical or otherwise, as basically the universe's way of showing us where we need to work on something. So symptoms and health problems, we call them problems, could be viewed in a similar way. It's like we're being given information. You need to look at something. So by suppressing the symptoms, and I can understand why this could need to happen sometimes, of course, when people are in pain, but generally speaking, it could lead one to then ignore the underlying problem. And on a soul spiritual level, it might impede the evolution.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it makes complete sense when you really focus on it. But again, the cultural conditioning is so strong around the idea of, disempowered health, of you being subject to things that you can't control, that it's easy to miss. But it's true. Like, if there's growth in everything, then there's growth in everything, including your disease processes and struggles. And just like with human behavioral growth, you often learn more from your failures and your struggles than you do from your successes. Mm-hmm. And it's, every successful person has a string of abysmal dumpster fire failures that they'll tell you about on the road to figuring it out. And it was those experiences that didn't go well that allowed them to get to the place where they were now through an evolutionary process. So I love that idea that reframing disease in general, is just more information to look at something in your body. Like,
Yeah, and sometimes the pain has to be so extreme before someone will actually make a change.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, it's almost like someone knocking on the door really loudly to wake you up. And if we look at it from that perspective, then illness isn't quite as scary, although it might be uncomfortable. It might just be more like information that we're gathering. Oh, these symptoms are emerging. What do I need to look at versus just pure fear?
Exactly. Like, oh goodness, I missed the last 5 off ramps and now I've been swiftly kicked in the head by the universe. Oh, fun. And I've been bedridden and forced to deal with this now, right? Like it's a much more empowering viewpoint than the idea that we're all just kind of waiting and hoping and cowering that some external invisible invader doesn't take us down, right? It's a very different way to view your role in the world that you create. Yeah.
Right. With germ theory, there's really no hope because it's all invisible and you have no control over it other than maybe to try to quote unquote improve your immune system, but it's not really clear how that even works. So you're just at the whim of things around you. You have no control over it versus this more empowering perspective is one where we do have control over our own psyche, that we can, even if we encounter a trauma or something that shocks us, we have an ability to then respond. And that's where
Absolutely.
we do have control. Like we can surrender to outcomes in the universe, but we can always control our own response.
Yeah. And the definition of trauma is very subjective. It's something that overwhelms your nervous system. I mean, that is the basis, definition of trauma. And it's very subjective. What one person can find traumatic, another person finds resilience building. And like trauma in general is very fascinating because it's such a personalized expression and experience. Because I've met people in real life that I helped with in my former world that, you would hear what their trauma experiences were and it would sound like, it doesn't seem very traumatic at all. And you'd meet someone else who had something, what you would consider horrible happen, and they had come through just fine with very little damage. And so a lot of it has to do with how you internalize and receive that, which is all psyche.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all your perspective and what you choose to do about it.
And I'm just trying to think, why is that so hard for some people to acknowledge? And I'll go back to myself, let's say 10 years ago, when I was more of a scientific materialist, where I thought it was all material. Because I look at things that I can see, and I can see that if you throw a baseball against the wall, there's physical contact. So it's like the same thing with illness. There's a tendency to want to find a physical cause. And we see this, you alluded to this before, like in the terrain model, it's often just a physical toxin or something that we can point to, or malnutrition of something that you put in your body. That's all good, but there might be these other elements of terrain. I like to call it like psycho-spiritual terrain in addition to the physical terrain of what's going on within our own consciousness. Because in a different metaphysics of how reality works, if consciousness is playing a fundamental role, then when you shift your consciousness, the physical world will change too.
Yeah, I mean, and you see that, play out as people begin to heal from big traumas and things that have happened in their lives. You see everything about them shift, right? Their very present shifts, all their possibilities shift, even their memories of past events shift as they heal those things. I mean, it's really quite fascinating to kind of sit with all that we've been missing through the lack of acknowledgement of this part of us, and, germ theory, this idea that that we're just waiting to be picked off, that we don't have any empowering sense, that anything that we touch can be coated in cooties or whatever. It's very different than viewing yourself as a whole sustainable person who is able to direct kind of the large course. It takes like epigenetics even a step further, Yeah.
Right. It's kind of a base level of causation that we're talking about.
Right.
And I'm glad you referenced this earlier because a lot of this no virus movement or the movement that's challenging germ theory, I think there's great stuff there, but often it does not acknowledge the metaphysical parts.
Right.
And it was one
That's
of the reasons.
My biggest beef with the no virus camp is they never acknowledged that piece.
It's critical. It's really critical to bring into it. And I can understand why some people don't want to, because it opens a whole other door of challenging belief systems, because some people are just not open. But for me, I saw a gap in the literature there where we needed more information on the no virus position and challenging germ theory and some of the crazy things. Like I should mention this, Daniel Roitas wrote a book, Can You Catch a Cold? Over 200 studies failing to demonstrate the contagion the alleged contagion of cold, for example, that there are other reasons people get sick. So that's all really important. But if we don't bring in the metaphysics, we're going to be missing something big. And that's where I was looking at in this book. What are the determinants of health and disease? That was my big question. The question wasn't, is there a virus? That's just part of the bigger issue. Why do we get sick? Why are we healthy? What really causes that?
Right. Yeah. What delineates the two, right? Because even family members with similar genetics and similar epigenetic experiences will have a totally different expression of health. And it can be really fascinating to see that.
And on the topic of genetics, this is not something I've looked at quite as closely, but a lot of people who have been questioning viruses, like Dr. Tom Cowan, they're looking at the foundational studies with regard to genetics and asking, wait, maybe do we have elements of that wrong? Have the nucleotides, which are the small portions of the DNA, have those been isolated properly? And if not, are there other reasons that we inherit traits? Because we all know there's heredity. The question is, does it come from a physical structure? I don't know the answer, but that raises all sorts of questions too. Like, might there be something energetic we get from our parents?
Absolutely. And, like epigenetics, because genetics for a long time was considered the foundation, that if you had a genetic expression, that you were doomed to get whatever. If you had the BRCA gene, you were going to get breast cancer and all these things. And now that's expanded into epigenetics, which is, like the case that the blueprint of the genes is carried in, where genes can switch on and off based on environmental or, mental, emotional factors, can turn switches on and off for your genetic expression in real time, which was forever thought to be an impossibility. So it's like, I wonder if we could take that one step further and apply consciousness to that. And like, what can we really do with ourselves and our bodies and our world with that bigger expanded awareness?
And until people start asking these questions,
right,
you might not know the answers. So I think there's a small movement right now. It's kind of underground, and I'm glad you're willing to cover it. And I wonder what will happen as more and more people wake up to this, because if it is true that consciousness plays a fundamental role in reality, and that when we shift our consciousness, the physical world shifts, even in a small way, what happens when a lot of people are having these shifts? What happens to our reality?
Yeah. And that like frames for me, a lot of people are talking about how this time we're in now is like a spiritual warfare. It's a battle for the hearts and minds of humans. And when you look at the consciousness aspect, it makes total sense why that would be a commodity they would seek, is they'd want to control that conscious energy and keep it at a lower frequency that's easily controlled versus allowing it to ascend to its full, blooming state, right? And so, that's something to consider also as we look at our own contributions to our world. Like, what are we putting out there, and why are we putting it out there that way? Right?
Exactly. And how has the world steered us toward a fear narrative? We saw this very clearly in 2020. The message was fear. It was not one of empowerment. And what does that do to people's health? I wonder.
It tanks it. Yeah. I was a practicing mental health professional during the pandemic, and I will tell you, I've never been busier with people that had previously been stable that had lost their stability. And I had never seen such a mental health crisis that was so manufactured before. And it was like really like the first collective trauma we've had as a people. Because usually, you have primary trauma, which you experience. You have secondary trauma where you witness someone else's trauma. Like 9/11 for a lot of people was a secondary trauma. If you were outside of New York, you witnessed it happen and traumatized through that, but you weren't a part of it. But the pandemic times was really like a global collective trauma. And it was really interesting to see how such pervasive fear messaging dissolved family units, dissolved people's, ability to function normally. Like it impacted them quite strongly. Mm.
And it was in many cases intentional. There's something.
Absolutely.
I've quoted this in a number of books. There was an undercover video by Project Veritas of a CNN technical director. He didn't know he was being filmed, but he said fear sells.
It does.
And that's what we saw that on the media. It was very clear. The tickers that showed the number of cases and all those sorts of things. It was constant fear narrative.
Has never been done. It had always been outcomes they would track before. It was always, the IFR, the infection to fatality ratio is what public health had always used to determine how panicked or not panicked to be about anything. They had never tracked case counts before because that's not a full story. Like, if you were to track, like, assuming there's a virus and assuming there's a stomach virus like norovirus, that, you'd see those same type of numbers as it go through the community and everybody spends their time vomiting or whatever they're doing, and then it passes through. If you were to track those case counts, you'd see a similar huge rise, but that's not the full story. people getting infected isn't the full story of an outcome, the same way that like an IFR metric is. And so I found that fascinating as it was being rolled out because it was so atypical. I'm not naive to public health mechanisms, and it had been the first time that I could recall ever that they had deviated from like an infection to fatality ratio as the metric to case counts, and that they were broadcasting them everywhere like, oh, it's coming for you, right? It was palpable fear.
And then we run into questions of where do those numbers come from? Is it just based on someone had a symptom and then you're calling it COVID? Is it based on a test? And if it's based on a test, what is
it a PCR test? What are the cycle thresholds? What are you looking for?
Yes. And if you haven't found the virus by itself, which by the way, Christine Massey and her colleagues who sent the Freedom of Information requests out, they've sent requests out to over 200 organizations in 40 countries. And they're all saying we have no purified sample of a SARS-CoV-2 virus. So if that's true, what are these tests? The tests are looking at something that they believe is associated with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but it might be something else. And we know they're false positives and false negatives. So something is wrong.
Yeah. The lack of transparency about all the things not understood is such a problem. You know, because how are people to decide when they're being told something as fact when it really isn't fact? And a lot of it is presumptive. And, you know, people make big decisions. I mean, global governments made huge decisions that did not benefit their populations at all out of this fear-based model, right? It was disastrous for economies, it was disastrous on every single level. Like they failed tremendously in the COVID response, and yet they're not making any real policy changes. Like next time you're definitely not going to lock me in my house to stop the spread for 2 weeks. Like that's never going to happen. And the loss of trust and the unwillingness for those powers that be to acknowledge the mistakes that were made and to try and just gaslight all of us like we didn't experience it, you know?
Right.
It's amazing.
And the unwillingness to even have these discussions.
Yeah.
And the unwillingness to acknowledge, like you said, where there's just indirect evidence. I'll give an analogy here. Imagine we see a footprint in the ground and we say, okay, well, we know this is a tiger footprint because we found a tiger and we can identify it's just like the footprint. So the footprint itself was indirect evidence of a tiger. We're seeing a similar analogy applied with viruses, except we don't have the tiger to know that it's associated. If we see this footprint that they say is associated with a virus, you would need to have the virus first to know that's what the footprint looks like. But we've never had the virus first. So even to call it indirect evidence is problematic when you haven't established that this entity even exists. And as Dr. Mark Bailey said in his essay, A Farewell to Virology, I'm paraphrasing him here, basically this whole industry of virology got ahead of itself and it built an industry around a particle that has not been established, which is just crazy.
Yeah, it's really wild. It reminds me like when people go out in the woods and they find Bigfoot footprints, you know, but we have no Bigfoot to compare it to. So nobody really knows what it is except it's a giant unknown footprint, right? It's like that. Like there's obviously something here, but we don't know what it's coming from. And they've just made tremendous assumptions. Like when I really could dive in and experience for myself that yes, the field of virology was well underway for decades, long before any kind of earnest attempt began to verify any of that. And then for reasons that seem inexplicable to me, they've stopped looking and they aren't willing to look. And we have the technology to be able to do it.
There's this logical fallacy that I see all over the place. It's known as affirming the consequent, where if X, then Y, Y, therefore X. And to simplify it, it's true that when it rains, the grass outside will be wet. But the second statement is problematic, which is I observe wet grass, therefore it rained. And that ignores all the other possibilities of dew or sprinklers or many other things. So let's apply this to viruses. It's true that if a virus existed, maybe we would see these symptoms and patterns of illness. We observed these symptoms and patterns of illness, therefore there was a virus. So illogical. There are many other reasons. And so it's like once we can start to deconstruct the flaws in logic and where we have indirect versus direct evidence, then I think things start to break down. But most people, they're so resistant to this because it's like layers of unlearning that they're not.
It's challenging their worldview, and humans hate to have to shift their worldview. I know this because I often help them shift their worldview against the culturally conditioned belief that vaccines are safe and effective in any amount at any time, any way. I bum a lot of people out because I create a lot of cognitive dissonance for them and internal and external conflict through the worldview shift. they don't like it. Yeah. I mean, I get that. And even within myself, as I was exploring these topics, there was a lot of internal resistance that came up because I just didn't want to have to do that mental work. I didn't want to have to re-examine all of those other, ancillary belief systems that were affected by that. And it gave me a lot of compassion for the work that I do with others. Like, oh, this is probably how I make other people feel a lot of the time.
This was a hard one for me too. When I wrote the draft of this book, the draft was almost a trial run to see if I could actually convince myself of these arguments because it was too hard to believe. And then I was looking at things, like the Spanish flu studies, the Rosenau studies. This Spanish flu was allegedly so contagious and so deadly. And there were studies done where they had sick people coughing in the faces of healthy people and no one got sick. And taking fluids from sick people and injecting them in healthy people, no one got sick. So what I realized as a pattern is that most people, including doctors, are operating on the assumptions that studies done long ago were done a certain way and that the textbooks are basically correct without actually examining those assumptions. Or like polio, the demonstration that it's contagious by taking an unpurified sample, including spinal fluids, and injecting it into a monkey's brain and saying that demonstrates contagion.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you read the evidence yourself, you can't not be shifted by it.
Yeah.
Because it's not ever what you're expecting. And you're like, this is the basis of all of this? Really? And it just makes you curious about other things that maybe are fallacies that you didn't recognize. But yeah, I bet you've made a fair amount of people uncomfortable at dinners there, Mr. Gober.
I probably have. What I've learned is I've learned not to bring this stuff up unless people ask or if I notice that they're receptive and want to have the conversation, because it usually doesn't go anywhere. If someone is not interested in the truth, then it doesn't matter what you say. If someone is and they're curious, then I might make them uncomfortable, but at least they're willing to be there.
Yeah. I mean, my whole job at TFEC is I train and recruit our Army, and we have an entire communications class entirely geared towards helping someone increase their willingness to hear it from you. And because you're right, they have to be willing, but sometimes they don't know that they're willing because they're just instantly put off by your approach. So you can definitely modify your communications approaches to help them be a little bit more willing to consider a worldview shift. But yeah, there's a lot of people that just aren't interested.
And one way to put it with regard to viruses, for example, because the term no virus can be very confronting to people to just start with viruses don't exist. That's just too much. And people might discredit you, actually. But if you start with actually the way the studies have been done for many decades, that they do not use an independent variable in proper controls. And therefore, the existence of a virus has not been established using basic elements of the scientific method. People might question for a second and say, okay, because you're not saying there isn't a virus. And actually, we could never prove a negative. It's possible that there exists a 13-headed spaghetti monster, even though we've never found it, for example. So all we can say is it has not been established using the scientific method, and that is a bit more disarming.
Right. Exactly. The communication approach that you take will determine the outcome in those encounters, because any kind of difficult topic, people naturally resist it. And if you come in hot saying things like no virus or you never should vaccinate, people will automatically get their feathers in a ruffle and they won't want to talk to you, and you'll be othered immediately, and you don't want to be othered in those encounters at all.
Exactly.
Yeah, you want to stay sane as long as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who want to get in touch with you, Mark Gober, where can people find you?
My website is a good place to start. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. I'm also on social media, Mark Gober Author. All my books are on Amazon, including An End to Upside Down Medicine, and they're available in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats, and I narrate the Audibles myself. I also have an 8-episode podcast series if your audience is interested in this topic of consciousness. It's from 2019, so it was before I was looking at viruses, and there might be a few statements about germs that I regret, but I didn't know any differently. But in any event, the topics around consciousness are relevant to this discussion. It's called Where Is My Mind? It's 8 episodes. You can binge it very quickly. It's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many other players.
Okay. I might have to listen to that. That sounds very interesting.
You can ignore the germ stuff. It's not a big part of it, but a few people have said, Mark, do you still believe what you said back then?
That's okay. I've been a medical liberty advocate for 25 years, and my positions on certain stuff has definitely shifted. And I kind of cringe looking at really old things too. So I identify with that. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. I really enjoyed your book. I really did read the whole thing. I recommend, it's totally worth it. I appreciated very much that never once did you tell your audience what they should think and feel, that you allowed us to decide for ourselves. I appreciate that tremendously. So Mark Gober, you can find him on markgober.com, and all 7 of his books are available on Amazon. And I am Carrie Bigford, Outreach Director with Texans for Vaccine Choice. And this has been another engaging episode of Shot Callers. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Shot Callers podcast. Please, if you found value in this content, rate us and share the podcast with a friend. It's a great way to get the message out and to empower everyone to make informed decisions. Until next time, never forget, we are the Shot Callers.